Hey there, I'm Landis Way with Charlotte Readers Podcast, where authors give voice to the written words. I'm pleased to be here today with the High Country Writers. We're doing this virtually, creating a little video ahead of the meeting, so you'll have this resource for future reference, and you can refer to it, and you can, if you got questions after our meeting, we can talk about that too. I'm very pleased to be speaking to this group because I'm in the group. You don't see me as much, but I'm going to get up there more, I hope. I've got a cabin in the mountains, and I like to get up there and try to catch a few trout every now and then, and hike in the mountains. And it's a great place for writers, I know. So wonderful that you've got this organization. Today I'm going to be talking about podcasting. I'm going to talk, and why am I doing that? Well, writers, some writers listen to podcasts. They like to listen and learn from podcasts. Other writers have actually started podcasts and have done so successfully. And then other writers have taken the opportunity to appear on podcasts to promote their work. So I'm going to be talking about three things today. I'm going to be sharing with you a little bit about the journey of Charlotte Readers Podcast, myself, a little bit about that. Then we're going to talk about podcasting, what it is, how to listen, maybe what you can gain from this medium of podcasting. And then I'm going to have some tips for authors. If you're interested in starting a podcast, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how it works. And then if you're interested in appearing on a podcast, I'm going to give you some suggestions for what you might follow to try to appear on a podcast and promote your work. But first, what I like to do is just tell you a little bit about myself. I'm a recovering trial lawyer. I practiced law in Charlotte for 35 years until I retired in December of 2018 from trial work. I went from a full-time paying job to a full-time non-paying job. I had this idea, having written 3 books of my own. I wrote a trilogy about lawyers who save Christmas. It's kind of a cross between My Cousin Vinny and Miracle on 34th Street. And I had a lot of fun doing it toward the end of my legal practice. And I thought, I wonder if I could start a podcast where I interview authors, talk to them about their work, learn about how they do their work, and not only that, but have them read their work, because there are a lot of podcasts out there that are just author interview based. But I thought, I wonder if I can have a podcast where authors come on and read their work and we talk about their work. And so I had this idea. I'd form Charlotte Readers Podcast, and when I started, I didn't know the difference between a mixing bowl and a mixing board. I had no idea how to get audio out into the world, into podcast land for people to listen to. I'll talk a little bit more about that part of things when we get into the, how to do a podcast if you want to do it. But long story short is I did start the podcast. We started in the fall of 2018. I got some authors from my critique group to come in and be my guinea pigs. We put it together. I thought I'd lost the file, didn't know what I was doing, but I did hire some folks to help me to kind of educate me and get started. And so I launched that first season, and it was 11 authors, local authors in Charlotte, who came on the show. They read some of their work. They talked about their work. And then I thought, I need to do more. I want to maybe continue to do what I'm doing here, but ramp it up, figure out how to use social media, figure out how to, do more with the editing software, figure out how to do more things. And so I started ramping things up, and we added another season. We added some sponsors, entered some contests. Fortunately, we had a contest in Charlotte. It was WFE, the local NPR station, ran a contest. We participated in it, and we finished 19th out of 370. I thought that was pretty good. So not bad to start out. That was in February of 2019. And then in that spring, we were invited to join the Queen City Podcast Network. That was a great honor to be affiliated with some other great podcasters in the area. We were the only ones doing, literature, so that was nice. And then as the year went on, we started adding more authors. We started getting more of a following. And at the end of the year, it was nice. We got some recognition from Queen City Nerve, which is a local newspaper in Charlotte. They voted us best podcast in Charlotte. Now, there are a lot of podcasts in Charlotte, a lot of great podcasts in Charlotte, but we appreciate the honor. We appreciate being recognized. I think we just put out so many episodes. They said, yeah, we got to give them some recognition here. But it was nice. We got that recognition. And so going into this year in 2020, thinking about how to, continue to lose money, which is what was doing, and I'll tell you how that works too, because this is a passion project for me. I'm putting some a lot of my own money into it to make it work. And I thought, but to take this to the next level, I think I'm going to have to do more, because I was doing an hour-long show, and I thought some people don't like an hour, some might want something shorter. Plus, I was getting all these submissions from really interesting, talented authors, and I was wondering, how do I go further if I'm already putting out a weekly show that's an hour-long show that takes me about 25 hours per show to produce? And I thought, I know, I've got so much extra time, I'll just start another show. I'll make it a 25-minute show, and that's what I did. I call it the Under the Covers episode. It runs for 25 minutes on Friday. So now I've got a Tuesday show and a Friday show. And then I said, oh, that's not enough. I'll add a Patreon page, and I'll be able to add exclusive content on that page that people can go and join and get exclusive content and help support the podcast. And so that's turned into something. I may talk about that a little bit later. I can answer questions about it. But as the story unfolded, I found that I really, really enjoyed spending time with authors and talking to them about their craft. And I really enjoyed listening to them read their work. And I have a wide variety of authors on the show. I have poets, I have short fiction, I have long fiction, I have nonfiction. We've done a lot of different things on the show. And so coming into the month of April, we had all these live podcasts set up. Dinner and a podcast. We had a live podcast with the Charlotte Writers Club. We had some other live podcast events set up. And of course, you know what happened. Along came the virus, and no more commingling, even in the podcast studio. So I had to readjust. I had to go to remote podcasting, and that was a real adventure, which is what I'm doing now. And it's fine. The audio quality is not quite what it is, but again, as writers, sometimes we think that perfect is the end result, but perfect is not always what you need, because perfectionism, I think, can sometimes hold us back. But in any event, yes, I'm remote podcasting, and while one door closed, that is, the live events shut down, and we couldn't celebrate a big party with our 100th episode in April, another door opened. I was able to reach out to a national author, Craig Johnson. He's the author of the New York Times bestselling Longmire series. They turned it into a Netflix original. He's in Ucross, Wyoming, population 25. I'd met him at a writing conference a couple of years ago. He was an instructor there in a conference I got into, the Looking Glass Rock Writing Conference, and really enjoyed what he had to say. And so I reached out to him. He said, yeah, I'll do it. So he did social distancing at its best. He was in Ucross, Wyoming. I was in Charlotte, North Carolina. We recorded that episode. It released on April 28th. It's a great insight to what a New York Times bestselling author does, who turns his books into a Netflix series. It's available at our website and on all major podcast platforms. So that was great. So here I am. We're moving into season 6. We've got an undercover show that releases. We've got 2 shows a week. We've got exclusive content we put up every week. And you're probably wondering, why am I doing this? And it kind of reminds me of that. Did you hear the one about the lawyer who walked into a podcast studio? And I tell people it sounds kind of like a bad dad joke, but that's kind of what it was when I, in the fall of 2018 said, yeah, I'm going to stop doing this thing called law that pays me good money. And I'm going to start doing this thing called podcasting that pays no money. But, I might as well have said, I'm going to stop practicing law and I'm going to do this thing called writing, because we all know that writing doesn't necessarily bring you money, but it brings you satisfaction. Now, for me, I didn't realize, and we'll talk about this more, that podcasting takes a bit more time than I thought it would. So it's kind of gotten a little bit in the way of the longer writing I want to do. I've had to do some shorter works during this period, but it's been a really energizing period of my life to be able to sit down with authors and ask them the questions that people don't always ask them, and to find out how they're feeling, to find out what they were thinking, to find out what bothers them, what energizes them, what was driving them to write, what they wrote, and then to hear them in their own words tell their stories. Because a lot of times, when you read something that someone else has written, you may not know exactly where the inflections are supposed to be, or, what their points of emphasis were. But when the author reads it, and particularly in poetry, you can hear it. It's more of it's a rhythm, that comes through. And that's what I try to do on the show. I try to have a format that allows you to get to know the author, lets them read some of their work, and if you're interested in what they have to read and say, you might go out and get their book. I don't get anything from their book sales. It's again, this is something that I like to do to support authors, but they've been very good about supporting the podcast too. They tweet about it and Facebook about it, and some of them have become member supporters on the Patreon page, and they do these Patreon exclusive craft interviews that I can make available to member supporters. So I thank them for that as well. That's just a little bit about my journey as a podcaster. When I was getting into this, I kind of looked around and to try to figure out, what was out there. I mean, and I didn't really find any podcasts out there that were doing it exactly the way that I came up with this plan. I mean, there are podcasts out there that do author interviews. There are podcasts out there that just read work. This is a bit of a blend of both, and it's regional and local based. So it's Charlotte, it's regional, it's North and South Carolina. I've gone into Georgia, Tennessee, and Virginia as well. And then with the magic of remote podcasting, I'm probably going to be able to expand even further, but still keeping that regional and local focus, which is something that I am really excited about. But that's it. 100 episodes as of April 28th in 18 months. I interviewed 117 authors for those 100 episodes. And just to put that in perspective, as a lawyer, I don't think I took that many depositions in 3 or 4 years of law practice, 117. And the thing was, I had an assistant then, I don't now. So it's been busy, but it's been rewarding to be able to sit down with the authors. And now I'm sitting down, but they're on the other side of the computer screen. We can see each other. It's just a remote environment. That's a little bit about me. I've written the trilogy of books I mentioned. I've written some essays, some short stories have been published. And I'm doing this thing called podcasting in my Act 3, even though it doesn't make any money. My dad, before he passed away and I was making this change, he said, "Landis, how do you make money at that?" And I said, "Dad, I don't make money at that." And he goes, And I could see his mind turning there. And he was a lawyer who practiced until he was 7 years old. He couldn't give it up because he said he couldn't figure out what he would do if he gave up the practice of law. So what I thought was, I'm going to come up with a plan. I'm going to do something that's going to, require commitment of time, require me to learn new things. And podcasting has required me to learn new skills. I had an entire IT department in a large law firm. Whenever I needed something done, I just raised my hand and they came in and they did it. Heck, if I forgot how to change my password, they would come in and do it. Now, I've had to learn a lot of those things. I've had to learn how to do editing. I've had to learn how to do some things with social media. I've had to learn how to put up posts through the back office of WordPress and work with the web designer. So it's been an education. And I think, really as writers, and this, you want to learn new things. You want to learn new things so that you can put them into your writing. This is just another new thing to learn. It's something we shouldn't be scared of. And recently somebody asked me, what about this transition to remote podcasting? How's it been? And I would say, frankly, there's been a little bit of anxiety connected to that, both for me and for the authors, because think about it, authors don't lots of times have to do Zoom-like, interviews. And when I'm the host and I want to be in charge of the technical aspects of it, I don't want to be worried about when, the internet gods are going to decide that he's said enough and shut off their voice, or, it's time to garble her voice a little bit so we can't hear it. So those things that don't happen in the studio sometimes happen remotely. Little anxiety there. But the good part is that authors are an inquisitive bunch. They're a curious bunch. And the authors that I've asked to do these remote recordings have said, yeah, what the hell, I'll give it a try. And they've learned a new skill. They've learned how to talk remotely to me, and we can put that into the world, as a podcast interview that we couldn't otherwise have done. And as I said, it led to this opportunity for me to interview Craig Johnson that I wouldn't otherwise have done either. So that's a little bit about my journey. What I'm going to do next is I'm going to take you over to my computer, and we're going to sit down, and I'm going to do a little PowerPoint presentation, a talk that I've given before about what a podcast is and how you can access podcasts. And then after that, I'm going to have a little conversation about how we as writers might use podcasts. That is, we might start our own, what would be involved in that, and how to get on a podcast and how to approach somebody that has got a podcast. So let's move over here to the computer and let's do this thing called What's a Podcast and Why Should We Do It? I hope you can see this PowerPoint. I'm aiming this video camera at my computer screen. It's probably not the best quality as if I was doing it otherwise, but it'll get the point across, I think. I've given this talk several times in Charlotte to various retirement communities because I thought it would be nice for people in those communities to learn a little bit more about podcasting and find out how the magic of podcasting could bring some joy to their lives. So this is a talk I've done about that. So just we'll get right into it. The first question sometimes people ask is, what the hell is a podcast? And really it's, I say it's kind of like a radio show that you can listen to at your own leisure. You can listen to it when you want to listen. That means you can listen to it when, where, and how. We're going to talk about the how in just a little bit, but you pick the time of day you want to listen. You pick where you want to listen. You want to listen in your car? Do you want to listen at your desk? Do you want to listen while you're walking? All of those are options, and it's really just these shows on demand. And there are hundreds of thousands of podcasts available that are free. And as you can see on the screen here, I did say free. Now, as I mentioned, when and where can you listen? You pick the time, you pick the place, home, car, plane. If you download it to your phone, and if we're able to get back on planes at some point, you can take it with you and listen as you go, walking, exercising, and you also pick the method that you want to listen on. You can listen to podcasts on your smartphone or your tablet or your computer. Now here's a big question that some people may be asking: why listen to podcasts? And in particular, when I talk a little bit later about why authors might want to listen to podcasts, here's what you've got. You've got all types of shows out there that are available. There's entertainment, literature, like the ones that I do on readings and the conversations we have about those readings, comedy shows, sports shows, dramatic tales with actors, like those old-time radio shows. They're out there on podcast, and it's a great way to hear theater type activity in your headphones. And then there's education. There are talk shows, there's how-to shows, there's self-help shows, there's medical shows, there's everything you could possibly think of to listen to in the podcast. Then the question becomes, how do you find your podcast? Well, you can do it a couple ways. You can go to your computer and look on iTunes to find it. You can also, if you've got an iPhone, you can go into your iPhone, and every iPhone is going to have this little, it's purple, it looks like a radio signal in the bottom left-hand corner of this picture. That is your podcast app, and that's on an iPhone. On Android devices, there are other apps. Spotify has an app. I've got an app over here called Pocket Cast, where I can store a lot of my podcasts. There's Spotify app. You see that one on this screen as well. So a lot of different ways, apps that you can listen to podcasts, primary one being Apple Podcasts. So you go there and you click on that purple app there, and it takes you to a screen that we'll get to in just a minute. But before we do, as I said, other apps and platforms: Stitcher, Google Podcasts, Spotify, TuneIn, iHeartRadio. These are all podcast platforms that Charlotte Readers Podcast is on, because once you're on Apple Podcasts and you do the things you need to do, it'll show up on these other podcasts as well. Okay, I mentioned that you can also listen at your computer screen. Well, this is how you do it with Charlotte Readers Podcast. If you go to our website, charlottereaderspodcast.com, we have a way that we divide the episodes into seasons, and we also now have the Under the Covers episodes I was mentioning. You can get those, and on the home page, it populates with the 6 most recent episodes, and you can just scroll down on the page. There's an audio player right there. You can click on your computer. If you like to listen to audio on your computer, you can do it right at your computer screen. The other thing you'll need if you're listening and you're on the go, or maybe just because your significant other doesn't like you blaring audio content from your computer, is to get some headphones and plug them in. You can either use the earbuds of the type that you see here, or you can get some fancier headphones that like the ones that I use for the podcast, but they're not that expensive and they're easy to pick up. So how do you find what you're looking for? Well, you can browse in the podcast app. So if you clicked on that app that I showed you earlier, that you'll have a browse button down here in the bottom. You hit browse and this will show up, and it just says, okay, here's something you might want to try, and you can scroll left to right to see different options that are there. In the bottom of that, you can see that one of our episodes was playing, and it just happens to be in the podcast player. This is a bigger screen of the browsing. If you're doing it on your computer or whatever, you can see over here on the left side, news and noteworthy. In the middle, you've got top shows. On the far right, they got some curated collections and celebrations. And then there are ways to do searches for particular shows. If you wanted to search for a show, for example, if you go to the right of the screen in the bottom in your podcast app, there's a search function. If you click on that, and this is usually in most apps, you'll find a search function. If you click on it and you go up here and you typed in to the left up here, Charlotte Readers Podcast, it'll pop up and you'll see this, what they call the podcast square. This is Charlotte Readers Podcast. You click on it and it'll take you to the podcast. Now, for some reason, when you search Charlotte Readers Podcast, it also pops up this podcast called Write Club. I guess that's because they're doing something similar to what I'm doing on the podcast. And sometimes you will get that. You'll get other choices, when you type in the podcast. So what happens when you're searching around, maybe you've searched podcasts on writing, or podcast on books, or podcast on, gardening, or podcast on finances, or whatever. And you go to the podcast and you'll see on the left-hand side here, you'll see the screen shot of the podcast square. You'll see the name of the podcast. You can subscribe with this little purple button here, and it doesn't cost you anything to subscribe. When you subscribe, it'll download, next episodes when they come in, and then usually there's a little description of what the show's about. My description says this is the show where we meet Charlotte area authors and those who visit the Queen City, and we hear them read their work. And that is what it was when it started. We've gotten more regional, and now that we're doing remote, we're even farther afield than that. But then you'll see that this screenshot was taken when we were at season 3. You'll see how it populates, what's going on in the seasons to the right side, and you can just kind of scroll through those. If you see something you like with a particular episode, you just click on it, and it'll play there right for you in your device. Now, here's another place that you might want to look, show ratings and reviews. If you scroll down to the bottom of a podcast episode, you'll see ratings and reviews. Fortunately, we have some good reviews here. At this time, we had 38 reviews about 6 months ago. Now we're up to about 59 reviews. And if you'd like to try out that review function after you've listened to the podcast, we certainly would appreciate it, because it's kind of like when authors give reviews for books. It helps. It helps. I mean, in our case, it'll help authors' voices travel farther and wider in podcast land. So this is where you find information about what others have thought of the show. So when you search for a show topic, you tap on the search function, you type in a topic. It might be exercise, reading or writing, health, politics, drama, gardening, whatever, as I said, and you can browse the results, touch them to read descriptions and reviews, and then pick something. It ain't gonna hurt you. I mean, it's like I tell my mother, you're not gonna break it when you push the button. If you actually subscribe to a show and you end up not liking it, you can always unsubscribe. It's no big deal. And so you can go in and try some things out. Here's what happens when you do subscribe, or this is just what my subscription library looked like at one time. I had something in here about the Ray Caruth podcast, which we had Scott Fowler on our show. He's a news reporter in Charlotte who wrote about Ray Caruth. Ray Caruth was the Carolina Panther who actually hired a hitman to murder his girlfriend, and spent many years in prison. And he does a whole series. It's about an 8-series podcast about that whole story. It's really interesting. It's a true crime journalism. It's done very well. Some other podcasts on here, Charlotte Talk, Charlotte Newsmaker, a branding show here. So subscribing, as I said, when you subscribe to a podcast, it's free. Just touch the subscribe button. You can always unsubscribe. When you subscribe to shows, it just means that new shows are going to be loaded in your app when those episodes are released, and you can listen. Even you can listen without downloading them to your phone if you have a good signal, either when you're out in the community or on your Wi-Fi, or you can download the episode to your phone or tablet and listen on a plane, for example. And you can also listen on your phone, as I said. This is an example of another podcast that I'm friends with. This author, Randall Jones, was on my podcast. He does a little podcast called 6 Minute Stories, and he started doing it after he was on my podcast. He has a collection that he does, an anthology where writers submit to be on in his anthology, and now he started to put those 6 Minute Stories into a podcast. It's a nice supplement to the written anthology that he's put together, and really nice for the authors who appear in that anthology. You can find him at Daniel Boone Footsteps, and they'll have another anthology coming out in August that you can submit to, and maybe you'll have maybe an essay in his collection and get on his podcast. As I said, listening on the computer, this is how you do it. That's my dad to the right, me to the left. I lost Dad last year, but we were out fishing one day and took that picture. And this particular episode I did at the beginning of season 2, right after he died, and he died in December of 2018, and this was the beginning of season 2. And I did a little episode where I actually talked about my father. You can listen to that at the beginning of season 2 of the podcast. So that's kind of it for what a podcast is and how to listen. I'm gonna shift back to a standing position here, maybe a sitting position. I haven't decided yet. We're going to talk about what would happen if you wanted to start a podcast. How would you go about it? And then maybe some things about how writers can use podcasts to their advantage, to help and promote their writing career. So I'm back now. I'm sitting at my desk. This is the place where I do remote podcasting, and we're going to talk now about why writers should care about podcasting. And if you do care, how much you use it, whether you start your own podcast or whether you get on someone else's podcast. So why should writers care about podcasts? Well, first of all, podcasts are a great form of entertainment. When you listen to writers read their work, you learn something about their style. And they've always said that great writers are also great readers. So if you want to learn something from the masters, you can listen to them read their work. The New Yorker has a great podcast. New Yorker does a podcast where writers read their work. You can listen to that, and you can learn from other writers. Of course, you can listen to Charlotte's podcast too. We've got some great writers reading as well. So that's one way. Another way is that it's a great form of education. We as authors, whether we're writing fiction or nonfiction, we're writing about things that maybe we know a lot about at times, but other times we have to go do research. We could do the research simply by going to the internet. We could do it by pulling a book off the shelf. Sometimes we could do it by watching television, but other times we could do it while we're walking, listening to a podcast. Say we want to find out about, a particular part of the world where there might be a podcast set in that country or about that country or about something related to that country that's of interest that you could listen to in the form of a podcast. Maybe there's a podcast about a nonfiction topic you're going to be writing on. You want to listen to it just to flesh out some ideas that you have, or setting. You can learn a lot through podcasts about setting. And then, of course, there is the writing angle. There are lots of podcasts out there. If you're going to start your podcast, maybe not the one where you're going to teach everybody how to write, because, well, there are a lot of those podcasts in the world, and they're done by some really great authors. But you can listen to those podcasts, and you can listen, with an eye toward improving your own craft. All you got to do is go in there and search writing in the podcast app, or search books or whatever, and you're going to find podcasts that teach you how to write. Same thing's true of podcasting. So I'll say that too. If you're interested in podcasting, type in search podcasting in the podcast, and you'll find a lot of podcasts about podcasting. But if you want to listen to other authors talk about writing, they're all different styles. There are ones that just give you 10 minutes of a writing tip a day. There are others that dive into particular topics for 30 minutes. There's some that are even longer than that. You can find a podcast to talk about any aspect of writing. Some authors, well-known authors, have done just a series of episodes relating to their writing. I know John Gresham did one that was periodic. There are other authors that do them from time to time, New York Times bestselling authors, and you can learn a lot by listening to what they have to say. Now, let's say that you like the idea of podcasting enough that you want to start your own podcast. Why would you do that as a writer? I've already told you my story and why I did it. I'm just engaged to be around other authors and enjoy the process, sitting down, interviewing them, and I've learned a whole lot in that process, and I like helping authors give voice to the written words. But I know that there are authors out there, they're not New York Times bestselling authors. They might be regional or local authors who've decided they just like, talking, and they like sharing in a different medium. I mean, you could do this. The podcast is kind of like the 21st century blog. It used to be that writers figured, well, I need to go write a blog to get people interested in me and what I'm doing, to follow me and then buy my books. Well, some writers have taken that to the next step, and they say, well, I'm going to do a podcast, and I'm going to use that to kind of build my author platform. You might do it because you think it'd be fun to do. You might do it because you have something to say that relates to what you're writing about. I mean, let's say you are writing a series of fiction books that are, set in outer space. Maybe you do an interesting science fiction podcast, but where you talk about the connection between what's real and what's not real, or maybe you talk about the other world or something of that nature. Podcasting can be a form of marketing. As I said, the old blog is now the new podcast. You could use the podcast as part of your platform to, get your writing into the world. But having said that, let me make a little caveat here. And we can talk about this further as I get into the actual, to-do list for a podcast. But there are now 1 million podcasts in the world. There are a lot more books in the world than that, but have you ever been in the library after you just finished your latest book and you look around, or you go to a bookstore and you look around and just all these books there competing with your book? Why are they going to read your book? Well, if you're like me, you don't write, and you don't write to get that book in the world to beat all the other books. I mean, it's a given that there are more books out there in the world, that are going to do better than your book, right? Same thing's true with podcasts. So don't go into this thinking you're going to go to the top 100 of podcasts and then you're going to make a bunch of money, that this is going to be the be-all and end-all to improving your marketing. So when I said if you're thinking about doing it because you think it might be fun, keep that at the top of the list as you're thinking about doing something like this. Maybe you don't like writing a blog, but maybe you'd like to do something fun related to this. You could decide, for example, if you wanted to do it, to just do a series. Maybe you do 8 shows and you decide you're going to leave it at that. You could put it on your website. You could have it connected to what you're doing. It might be about a series you're writing. It might be about topics you're writing. It might be that you just decide to get together with another author and split the cost and split the fun and sit down and the two of you talk about something related to it. Maybe, the high country writers decide they want to do a podcast. And as part of that, they decide, someone's going to be the podcast master and is going to, create some audio from different meetings and put that out as a way to attract other members. I mean, there are all kind of ideas that you might have for how to use a podcast to get your voice into the world, because podcasts spread through social media. They spread when other people, share them. And the good thing about them, unlike just a talk you do at the at the library or at the bookstore, once you do that podcast, it's there. You can refer people to it later. They can go back to it. Maybe you do a book event that turns into a live podcast like I've done a couple of times, and you have that on your website that, is an interview of you about your books or your writings or whatever. So I want to make that caveat, that is, Don't go into there thinking, this is just going to be, the end all. But if you think it'd be something fun to do as part of your platform, then think about that. All right, let's shift here real quick and talk about, the how-to of podcasting. I'm not going to give a whole lecture here about that discussion. I'm not an expert in a lot of different areas, just what I've learned to do. I've spoken before on the topic, but from a technical standpoint, there are a lot of people better qualified to speak on that. But you got to have a couple of things. But you've got to have a couple of things, and one of the things you might think about having, kind of like when you're an author, is a website. This is our website right here. This is Craig Johnson. This is the latest post. You can see that if you scroll down, you get the previous episodes here. You can click on them and see them and so forth. And we've decided we've got episodes page, news, exclusive content, the way to submit, all these different kind of things. So having a website is a pretty good thing to do. You can do a podcast without a website, but if you're thinking about having a podcast that's going to go over a period of time, having a website to put your images and links in addition to what goes out over the podcast world vibes is worth having. So think about that if you're going to do this. Now, if you've already got your author website, you can tag into that site to set up a link to your podcast, which is the way that some authors do it. They've got a following or they've got information about their books. Well, now they've got a link to their podcast and they populate the podcast episodes there. All right, so as I said, you might have this podcast and your website. If you decide you're going to do remote recording, you're going to get something like, if I get it up here on the screen, this is right here. You might not see very well, but Squadcast. Squadcast is what I use for my remote podcasting. What it does, it puts two people in the room together, the internet room together, and record on both ends. They mix the files together. You get it. The pricing for that, and I'm not getting anything from Squadcast to do this. I just want to tell you, it's fairly reasonable because for $9 a month, you get 2 hours of recording. $17 a month, you get 5 hours of recording a month. You can go higher than that. $38 a month, you get 12 hours of recording a month. So you can do a lot of podcast recording for less than $40 a month remotely with you set up with Squadcast. Now, what you're going to have to do if you set up with something like this is you're going to have a microphone like what's behind me here. And this particular microphone I've connected into my computer with a USB connection. This particular service, you got to have Google Chrome to log into. The only thing I do for this particular service to podcast remotely is I have my microphone, I have it plugged in with my USB to my computer. I log on. I have headphones. Those are connected because you got to have the headphones on so the sound doesn't bounce and echo. And so you got that. Your headphones, your microphone, you're plugged in. You've got your monthly fee. You hit record, and it's going to record files on both ends, on the end of where the person is in their home and where you are. And then at the very end, you can download those files. You can actually then mix those files together, and that's then when the editing process, takes over. But that's a very easy, inexpensive way to do it. This microphone here behind me is, I think it's an ATR Audio Technica. It's only about $60. I have two of those. Mic stand was probably $30 or $40. Headphones, Audio Technica, I think these are in the $80 to $90 range. And then if you're not doing it over the internet, which is what I do when I'm in the studio, I've got this. It's a Zoom H5 audio recorder. The reason I have this is got really good quality. This is about $250. You can get other kits, but I use this in the studio. It has these XLR connections here. I can connect those into the mixer in the studio, and if you learn how to use that, then basically all the audio comes into your SD card on your Zoom H5. You've got it, you take it home with you, you can then load it to your computer and you can edit it. So those are some of the basic things that you need to podcast. And when you are thinking about whether you want to do this, in addition to the equipment and the website, you're going to have some audio hosting. And usually there are a bunch of different services out there that host your audio. If you're not doing too much a month, it's about $20 a month. You can go with Libsyn. I use Blueberry. There are other services as well. And basically, that's a place where your audio gets uploaded and stored. And then it, with the RSS feed that you sign up for, it populates to Apple Podcasts, which then populates to the other podcast services. So you need an audio host. You need to pick one of those and sign up. And you need a web host, of course, for your website. So you got some costs that you're going to have to get started. But really, you could do a podcast without a website. You could just sign up for one of the audio hosts. Some of those have their own websites built in. You can have a service with them on a monthly basis. You can record your audio, upload it to your audio hosting service, get your RSS feed, and it'll go out there into the world. With Blueberry, the one that I use, it also has a plugin that goes into my website so that when it's time for me to release an episode, after I recorded with Craig Johnson here, for example, what I would do is I would then take that audio after I've edited it, upload it in the back office, and schedule it on my website. It releases at a certain time there, and then it populates into the podcast world, at the same time. So that's one way to do it. I don't want to get too technical here because I just want to let you know that there are ways to get into it inexpensively, and there are ways to, as like anything else, like think golf, for example, or fly fishing or whatever. There's always other gadgets to buy and always other ways to spend your money. But other things you need to be thinking about, if you're going to start your podcast, is the time commitment. I spend a significant amount of time producing this podcast because I want to do it right, and I'm putting out 2 shows a week. That's not to say that if you have in mind to do something shorter, say a series of 8 episodes. I mentioned to you earlier the Caruth podcast. That was just 8 episodes and got a significant number of downloads, but it was something that was very interesting, something that was topical. Maybe you decide to do a series of 10 episodes, and that's your entire podcast, and you're done with it, and you put that on your website, and you get your social. I don't know what that would cost, but it's probably a manageable fee. You'd have some costs going into it. You can join these services and do them remotely, or you can sit down with one of these devices across from somebody and record it with them that way, or you can go into the studio as well and record, because you can rent studio space. So that's one option as well. But time is a factor. Don't think that just because this is going to be something you think will help your platform, that you can just drop in and do it and get out of it. Like anything else that's new that you learn, there is a learning curve with everything. Now, the good thing is, at the end of the day, you'll know a lot more about how to do some technical things, and it's helped me, frankly, on the writing side, because I've learned how to do more graphics. Let me give you a tip. There's something out there called Canva, C-A-N-V-A, canva.com. You can go to these powerful suites that allow you to do graphics, but Canva is very easy to use. There's a free version. There's another version, and I'm not getting paid by Canva for this, but for about $110 a year or something like that, you can get a pro subscription. You get access to all of these different graphics that you can then put in there. So if you're one of these people that likes to play around with graphics, and it's a very user-friendly environment, they got all kind of ways that you can do that through social media or other schematics. So check it out. Just look at canva.com and check it out. I use that to create graphics. Hate to say this, but social media is a thing. We could do a whole deal on social media. We're not going to do that. Y'all probably talked about that before. But to get your podcast known and recognized, you need to do a little bit of social media stuff out there to get it known. And there is the cost and the time component. Now, I think I've mentioned to you that you can go into this with both feet, full force, and spend a lot of time and energy, as I've done, or you can try to go in and do it because you've got an idea of something you want to do maybe once a month, just for your writing group or your writing organization, or maybe you want to do just a series of podcasts with someone that you're close to because you like talking about a particular topic and you just want to do it, and you don't care whether you get 10 or 20 or 30 people only to listen to it, because hey, it's fun to do, and the people that do listen are going to probably enjoy it. And that's the other thing that I've had to learn as a podcaster. It's not how many downloads you get, but it's the quality of the content and whether or not the people that are listening are enjoying what you're doing. Here's what I like to say about this podcasting thing for authors. If you go to a bookstore to promote your book, how many people typically are going to show up? Sometimes nobody shows up, right? You've done that. I've been there. Sometimes 20 or 30 people show up if you're lucky. In a podcast, I mean, our podcast now, after 3 or 4 weeks, 200 people have listened to a particular show. And then they continue to grow, when people find back episodes. Well, that's a great way to continue to get your voice out there and your books out there in a way you can't do in real life, because you can't go duplicate that. I mean, even the best writers have difficult times getting more than 50 people to show up to listen to them, do a book signing or talk about their books. But a podcast is a way for you to get into people's heads, literally, because they're wearing their headphones and listening to you talk about a topic that's passionate to you. Make sure, though, that it is, that you're passionate about what you're talking about, that you're committed to doing it, because it's just like writing. If you're not passionate about what you're writing about, the reader's not going to be passionate about it. And if you're not committed and engaged with what you're podcasting about, I guarantee you people aren't going to be interested in listening. But if you are engaged and you've got something interesting to say, podcasting might be something fun for you to do. All right, having said that, I'm going to finish up with this little bit. People also use podcasting, authors do, to try to promote their work by submitting to and becoming guests on other people's shows. That certainly is a method by which you can try to promote yourself as an author. I would say this, though, be very careful about that. Be very careful about how you go about it. You don't want to be that guy, the one that's just trying to use that podcast for your own purposes. Now, what do I mean by that? So, being on a podcast certainly can help your author profile, but remember, and be very wary of this. There are a lot of internet service providers out there, not internet service providers. There are a lot of people that advertise on the internet. They can get you on a podcast, so they can promote your book, this, that, and the other. We ought to be wary of that right from the beginning. Podcast hosts can smell, those kind of submissions a mile away. If you're just shotgunning submissions to try to get on a show, it demonstrates that you're not really respecting the show. And I would be worried about spending money on somebody else to go find an opportunity for you to be on a podcast, rather than yourself researching podcasts that you like, just like you might research a journal that you like, that you might want to have your work appear in. I guarantee you that the editors of that journal are probably going to appreciate it more if you subscribe to their journal, you're a regular reader, when it comes time to submit to that journal. So don't be that guy. When you go in and you're going to want to submit to improve your author platform, to be on somebody else's podcast, do your research. Go check their website out. Look them up. See what's going on there. Find out what's been on the show before. Find out what you can do for this show that might be unique and different, what you bring to the table. Don't just expect that because you've written a book that this podcast is necessarily going to want to have you on the show. But recognize, for example, that if you listen to their shows, if you subscribe to their shows, if you respect them by making sure you're a good fit, you follow their submission guidelines. That applies not just in podcasting, but when you're submitting your work. And you don't treat the show simply as a way to promote your work, but you bring something to the table. You remember, when people on interview-based podcasts, they're looking to entertain their audience, right? They want something that their audience is going to enjoy, right? It's not just about you and your book and you wanting to sell your book. It's about what you can bring to that particular show that will be of interest to that audience. And you may think you've written the best book in the world. That's great. But if it's your very first book and you've published it yourself and you didn't get an editor and you just uploaded it and now you want to go, let's get on somebody's podcast, that might not be the best approach. And sometimes I've had to say to authors who've submitted, I like what you're doing. It's your first book. Please come back to me after you've written your second or your third book. Maybe then we can talk about, the arc of your work, sort of, all of the work that you've been doing, highlighting one particular book. So in other words, don't give up if you don't get accepted the first time, but consider going back. But also don't show up the first time with a handwritten manuscript you just uploaded to Amazon without any feedback from anybody. And think about that particular show and what you can do to bring something to the show. Don't just tell us about your book, but tell us something interesting about yourself, that might be of interest to talk about on the show in addition to what you've written. And then finally, if you are invited to participate on a show, if you do submit, you follow the guidelines, you make a compelling submission, you've got an interesting book or series of books, and you've gotten some recognition for those books, and it would be of interest to be on the show, do something to support the show. Subscribe to their email list. Leave them a review on Apple Podcasts. That helps the show and it helps them move forward. Tell others about the show. Do something, support them on social media, share and friend them and that kind of thing. Don't just drop in and drop out, and particularly on a show like mine where I'm funding it and I'm trying to do all this myself. I really do appreciate when the authors who've been on the show continue to share episodes that come out on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and so forth. And, when they talk to others about it and kind of generate that interest, because the more people that listen, the more downloads that we get, then it becomes necessary perhaps to generate some revenue. And I intentionally didn't talk about revenue. I kind of joked with you earlier about not using this to make a living. And I want you to think about that when you go into this, because unless you're going into this, full force, and you're going to be spending a lot of money, don't expect to make a lot of money doing this. There are ways to make it, but you've got to build up a following. I've been fortunate that Park Road Books, the oldest and independent bookstore in Charlotte, is sponsoring the show. Great bookstore in Charlotte, and also the Charlotte Mecklenburg Library is a sponsor of the show. But those sponsorship dollars don't cover all of my costs, which is why I started a Patreon channel. And I don't know if you're familiar with Patreon, but it's a way that creators can allow others in the community to help them move forward a particular project. It might be a video they're doing, a small film they're doing. It might be a book they're doing. It might be something, but Patreon and for podcasters is a way to get community support. And what I do with the author community is the authors come on and we record these craft lectures. And right now I've got about 20 hours, 20 different episodes up on the Patreon feed, everything from how to write a good story to internet marketing to social media to ones that I've done that are coming out in May on the editing process and also on sort of how to write short fiction. And all these are authors that have been on the show who've got a body of work, and they come on. We just have a conversation about a particular part of writing craft. I play the student, they play the expert, and we have an hour-long conversation about that. And the cool thing about the Patreon page is you've got this RSS feed, and you can listen to this wherever you are. Maybe you're taking a break from writing, you want to listen, you put it in, comes on, you can listen to someone talking about how to write flash fiction, or how to write interesting characters, or how to write villains. These are all things we've had in the craft area. So that's what I've done with Patreon. It's another way that I can get content in the world and get support for the show. But if you're just doing your own show and you're not going to be spending a lot of money, as I've been doing by hiring a social media team and a marketing person and putting all these costs into the two shows and Patreon, then you can do it on a better budget that you can sort of build into your author budget and make it part of what you do. Remember though, there are a million podcasts out there. There'll be a lot of competition. So maybe don't think about it as much as competition as it is for another way that you might build a platform. If nothing else today, I hope you've gotten sort of an idea as to what podcasting is about, a little bit about my journey and how I'm using podcasting to help authors tell their stories. It might someday spark something of interest to you in the podcasting world. Maybe something that I've said will help you get on a podcast and tell your story verbally, and maybe it gives you an idea for your audiobook, and maybe you prime out your audiobook with some podcast episodes. I mean, really, the possibilities are endless. There's a lot to do here with this medium. So thank you for listening. I look forward to being on the Zoom podcast meeting with you and answering any questions you have. Hope you've enjoyed this sort of look behind the scenes of Charlotte Reader's podcast and some of my own thoughts about podcasting and writing and how you might use that to help build your author platforms. Thank you.